This is Books of Titans, the podcast dedicated to the influences of influencers. The books that have helped shape prominent inventors, business leaders, athletes, intellectuals, scientists, and others. We'll talk about what makes these books such classics, and at least attempt to have an intelligent discussion about what makes them so important and influential.
Today we're going to discuss Fooled by Randomness by Nassim Taleb. This book was suggested by 8 or so different people on the Tim Ferriss Show podcast, including guests such as Mark Bell, Art Devani, Walter O'Brien, Matt Mullenweg, James Altucher, and Ryan Holiday. And there's one more in episode 155. But this was one of 5 books suggested by you, Jason, for this year. So this is the second book.
This is the second one on the list that I suggested for you, at least. I was going to read this regardless.
So tell us why you suggested this one for me to read.
Well, I've been a fan of Talib's work for quite a while now. I think he's one of the brightest thinkers out there. He's a bit iconoclastic, which I tend to like. And very, very willing to think against the grain, and has made a lot of money thinking against the grain. And I think his approach to statistics and basically just thinking about how, his specialty, it really has been randomness and rare events and that sort of thing. And that's how he's made his money, is betting against the market on expecting rare events. He I think does a better job explaining how probabilities and randomness actually work for a layman than just about anybody out there. I think he just does a tremendous job with that. And I don't know that there's anyone, I can't think of any type of person who wouldn't benefit from engaging with and interacting with Talib's main points about how the world works in terms of probabilities and randomness and all these things, just in terms of understanding certain things are out of our control, and learning to control what you can control, learning to prepare for the things that you can't control, and so on. There's just a lot of potential fruit there. And so I wanted to make sure that we got a chance to discuss this one this year, and thought you'd really benefit from it. So, like I said, I think basically everybody could. Yeah.
Well, it's funny you said it's written for the layman, and it's also interesting that, because I just run, I decide on the 52 books, and then I run them through a randomizer. So it was interesting to me that Kahneman's book came up before this one, so we got to read that one before this one. But back to the layman's term, I almost learned more about Kahneman's work from this book than in Kahneman's book.
Yeah.
Because he does have that good way of putting things in not only just for layman, like in layman's terms, but also really funny. I mean, I was just laughing the whole book.
Well, again, he's so irreverent and iconoclastic. And I mean, he goes out of his way. I mean, he's a great follow on Twitter, who, and we'll link that in the show notes, of course, but he's a great follow on Twitter, in part because he just finds ways to pick fights with people that he regards. So you have to have followed his work for a while to know that he's got like little acronyms and things, such as the intellectual yet idiot. So there's actually he's got an article online that we'll go ahead and link to, that's actually his explanation of what the IYI is. So he refers to these people as IYIs in shorthand on Twitter or whatever. And, you know, if you've been following him a while, you know he means that this is an intellectual yet idiot. So
I think you brought this up in the Heraclidian fire.
Yeah, I did.
Episode.
Yeah, you're right.
With the Fock idiot.
Yeah, it's exactly right. And again, Talib is so much in the same sort of vein intellectually with a guy like Chargaff, who wrote Heraclidian Fire, with some of these certainly with he's of an intellectual piece with Feynman, with Richard Feynman, who again, you know, Feynman railed against the ridiculously unnecessary jargonish writing of humanities and social scientists, humanities people and social scientists, and basically talked about how, listen, if you can't explain things simply, it's just because you don't really know it. Mm-hmm. And Talib goes into the same kinds of diatribes, and he does this all the time. And it's just, he's again, he is a brilliant guy. Now, and I hate to say this in the same breath as that, but I also regard him so much as a kindred spirit in a lot of the same, like he has the same kinds of antipathies that I do, where it's like, oh, come on. You know, if you can't say it simpler than that, that's just because you are an idiot and you're trying to sound smart.
Yeah.
Right. And actually a friend of mine recently sent me his, a good friend of mine who's a molecular biophysicist sent me his teaching statement. He's applying for some jobs and so on. He's been on a postdoc for a while, and now he's working his way around in terms of the job application season and all that. And he sent me his teaching statement and said, "Hey, can you take a look at this?" And I sent it back to him, and I was like, "What is this? Like, why are you writing like someone who's just trying, like, this sounds like you're trying to hit all of the things that you need to say, but don't believe a word of it. And you're actually just, you know, you're just trying to hit the buzzwords, and it's just drivel." And he was like, "Well, you're the only person that said that, but you are right. Like, I don't believe what I'm saying." And I was like, "It's totally obvious." Like, so, and so we ended up, you know, he ended up going back and rewriting it and actually put together a really good one. And he's just really bright. And he has he's the same kind of thing where he's like, all these people in my field are such idiots. They just expect, like, if you put the right words in the right order and so on, and you make sure you use big words, people think you're really smart. So he was trying to do that in his like, he was intentionally trying to do that in his teaching statement. And I convinced him to go otherwise. But Talib is someone who just has no tolerance for that. Yeah. And you can see why in this book. It's just brilliant. But yeah, his IYIs, his intellectual yet idiots, are, you know, they're people who are, you know, some Ivy League, Oxford, Cambridge, or similar label-driven education who are telling the rest of us, 1, what to do, 2, what to eat, 3, how to speak, 4, how to think, and 5, how to vote for. And then he goes in and he says, the problem is the one-eyed following the blind. These self-described members of the intelligentsia can't find a coconut in Coconut Island, meaning they aren't intelligent enough to define intelligence, hence fall into circularities. But their main skill is capacity to pass exams written by people like them. With psychology papers replicating less than 40%, dietary advice reversing after 30 years of fat phobia, macroeconomic analysis working worse than astrology, the appointment of Bernanke, who is less than clueless of the risks, and pharmaceutical trials replicating at best only a third of the time, people are perfectly entitled to rely on their own ancestral instinct and listen to their grandmothers or Montaigne in such filtered classical knowledge with a better track record than these policy-making goons. It's just, you know, that's from his intellectual yet idiot chapter in Skin in the Game, which, you know, it's just terrific.
Well, and you mentioned he picks fights on Twitter, and I actually made a list of people that he managed to tick off in this book, and So I'll just read through that. I kind of made it as I read. Journalists, economists,
MBAs,
scientists, finance professors, the author of The Millionaire Next Door, Warren Buffett, MBAs, and the author of the Da Vinci Code, Dan Brown.
And George Will, especially among journalists.
George Will.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
So, it's quite
yeah, he does not hold back at all. And I love him for that. And I think he's got a lot to say and a lot to teach in these books. So we should probably get to that.
Yeah. Yep. So, we kind of hit on some initial thoughts, but I did want to read the initial or the paragraph in the preface, just the first paragraph. This book is the synthesis of, on one hand, the no-nonsense practitioner of uncertainty who spent his professional life trying to resist being fooled by randomness and trick the emotions associated with the probabilistic outcomes, and, on the other hand, the aesthetically obsessed, literature-loving human being willing to be fooled by any form of nonsense that is polished, refined, original, and tasteful. I am not capable of avoiding being the fool of randomness. What I can do is confine it to where it belongs, where it brings some aesthetic gratification.
Yeah, what a great opening paragraph. Yeah. I mean, seriously.
In the column I wrote, okay, I'll bite.
Yeah, so. and he just, I mean, again, he's very much in the same, in terms of a writer, I'd put him in the same kind of, as an essayist, let's just put it this way. I mean, because they had some other additional things in terms of writing fiction and all that. But as an essayist, I put him there in the same kind of trajectory as someone like G.K. Chesterton or C.S. Lewis. The same kind of acerbic wit and humor and biting sarcasm and self-deprecation, the same appreciation of aesthetics and tradition, and the same just razor sharp intellect that those guys had. And that people like this are a joy for me to read. So that's my initial, we usually do our initial reactions at the beginning. I've already given you mine, so more of yours. Yeah,
very similar. It was a joy to read. And he actually wrote that in the end. Like, I hope this book is a joy to read, and it definitely was. Another initial reaction is his style of writing. It's not really like at least how I viewed it. It didn't seem like a linear approach that most books take. Like, this building on this, building on this. The approach almost seemed more random. It was like he would bring in things from different areas, and then it all tied together. And I actually really enjoy that. But
it's really a collection of essays that are bound together in sections to reinforce one another. So he does come around to certain points again and again, but it's not repetitious. That's what's so brilliant about it, is he's able to do all of that at once.
Yeah.
That's keeping a lot of balls in the air intellectually to be able to write like that. So I respect the craft of it.
You've read other of his. Do his other works follow this kind of a format?
He's always like this.
Okay.
Yeah. He gets an idea and he writes around the idea.
Yeah.
And and you notice at the end of the book, he talks about how when this book began to have success, or I don't know if you read the second edition. I read the second edition for the show, but the end of the second edition, he talks about how when this book began to have success, he began to get, journal editors and so on asking him to write some distillations of some of his ideas for publication in articles and things like that. And they'd ask him, like, how long will it be? And he found that writing writing in that way, with a specific set word limit and specific, trying to get a specific outline going at the beginning and all that, he found that completely stultifying and really painful. He said it was not fun to write for the first time in his life. He had no fun writing. Whereas he finds writing something like this, it's just, it's like breathing for him. Well, that's the thing, is that he's actually writing to distill his own thoughts. He gets these ideas and he's trying to distill the concept that he's recognizing that other people haven't gotten well enough, and that he needs to get on paper to really distill it in his own mind. And so he writes around it and then just keeps polishing and getting all this together until it fits together. And then he's got his book. Mm-hmm. And there's a real craft to that. And I think that also serves well for the reader, who you get to think along with him to some degree with these. So,
yeah. Well, yeah. And the main gist of the book is, as described in the title, is that we are easily fooled by randomness. And he goes into different ways that happens. We're going to cover a lot of those in subsequent sections here, and I think we'll actually probably cover a lot of them in our quotes. Yeah, because there's some with him being so witty and sarcastic, the quotes were quite abundant. So let's go ahead and jump into those.
And one other thing that I think we should do right up front is talk about what he means by randomness. So what he's really getting at in terms of being fooled by randomness is really this idea, and this is the one of the central pieces of the book, is that there is a tremendous amount of just straight up chance that determines what happens in life. So, let's say you apply to a university, and you apply to an exclusive university, and you've got a 3.9, or well, I guess whatever the weighted GPA equivalent would be these days to that. But you've got, a top level GPA, you got great test scores and everything. Well, you still, even with all that, given all the other people who are applying, you still may only have a 60% chance of getting in. Right? Because there's all sorts of other people that are equally qualified that are valedictorians in their class or whatever, and you may not get into that exclusive school. And the difference between going there and going somewhere else that might be equally exclusive, that's a massive difference in your life. Obviously, we understand that aspect of chance is always there, but there's all sorts of other things that involve chance that we just don't appreciate. And we've talked about this going all the way back to Malcolm Gladwell's Outliers, where Gladwell talked about, look, if you're born in a specific part of the year, that's totally out of your control. It's a random thing in large degree, and it can totally determine whether or not you have a chance to become a billionaire in a given industry. That could be the determining factor. You could be just as brilliant as Steve Jobs, more brilliant, but you were born 3 months too early or 3 months too late.
Yeah.
You missed the window.
Well, and then a couple cool things about that, you bringing up Gladwell, he talks with him regularly, and then, he meets with Kahneman. So it's like a lot of the other people we've read. Yeah. There's a little intellectual cadre. Yeah. Yeah. So that part was cool. And then along with what you're saying there about randomness, like the other side of it is we look at successful people and think that they were successful based on these certain criteria. And in one of his points, I said that he ripped on Warren Buffett in the book. One of his points in the book is, statistically, you're going to get a Warren Buffett out of all the people picking stocks and doing that. You're going to have somebody that has that level of success just by random chance.
It doesn't actually mean that he was smarter or did anything better than anybody else. And that's the part that I should have finished in my explanation, what he means by fooled by randomness. The randomness thing is there. The place where we get fooled by it is when we then begin to assign, like you're saying, we begin to assign intelligence or some other quality to people on the basis of their success, when their success may be entirely the basis of total randomness. And all of our success or failure is the result of some combination of randomness and other factors that we actually have control over. And how much is due to randomness is often difficult to determine. And that's what this book is very much about. And it's well worth that read.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, you want to start with your first quote?
Why don't you take your first one?
All right. Well, since I have some business degrees, I don't have an MBA, but I have a MIB, which is a Master's of International Business, which is basically an MBA, but instead of finance, I took international finance, and
it means you can speak the Espanol.
Yeah, and I had to do some stuff in another country. Since I have that background, I'm going to read some of the MBA quotes where he rips MBAs. The first one: I beg the MBA reader not to take offense. I am myself an unhappy holder of the degree. So that's how he starts off. But then, surprisingly, MBAs, in spite of the insults, represent a significant portion of my readership, simply because they think that my ideas apply to other MBAs and not to them.
Yep.
Those are just a few of the great rips that he did on MBAs, which, Jason, you've stated before that you agree with in terms of.
Oh yeah, in terms of
business students and
the students that I tend to get in my classes, yeah, that matches up well. So here's a good one. I believe that the principal asset I need to protect and cultivate is my deep-seated intellectual insecurity. My motto is, my principal activity is to tease those who take themselves and the quality of their knowledge too seriously.
Yep, he does that.
Yeah, and he continues there. He says, cultivating such insecurity in the place of intellectual confidence may be a strange aim and one that's not easy to implement. To do so, we need to purge our minds of the recent tradition of intellectual certainties. And again, that's what this book is so much about, is it's teaching us that a lot of what we hold to be true isn't necessarily true. These people may not be successful because they were smart. They may just have been lucky. This may not have worked because of good planning. It may have just been random chance. And we need to account for that in how we're actually planning for the future. You can't just go off of track record, because you know what? You just may have enough idiots doing it, enough monkeys at the typewriter that the result is completely chance as opposed to artistry, as opposed to skill. And so he really wants to push this idea of understanding exactly how little we do understand. This is very much Socrates. Understand that you really don't know anything, and then plan accordingly. That's what he wants you to do.
Well, and along those lines, my next line of quotes deal with journalism, which he despises, and I loved that, because I've given up news lately, and this kind of gave some words to what I've kind of sensed or felt about news and journalism. So. But his point, along with what you were just saying, is a lot of what you hear about news, like you can't comment on something as it's happening. There's, and especially if you're not considering historical ramifications and
which you often can't know. That's his point.
Yeah, and you can't do it in a 24-hour news cycle. Like you're just trying to comment on stuff, and it's not really.
Well, I love his comments on the, the Dow went down, 0.5% today on the basis of such and such. And he's like,
yeah.
How would you know that it was on the basis of what it's gone down 0.5%? That's called noise. Yeah. It went down, meaning it went down by so little that it's meaningless. The only explanation is there was no meaningful move today, and it's total noise. So carry on.
Well, and that's and that's a good distinction in the book between noise and meaning. So that was very helpful to think of things in those terms. So my journalism quotes, I've got two here. Journalism may be the greatest plague we face today, as the world becomes more and more complicated, and our minds are trained for more and more simplification. And then the second one, it takes a huge investment in introspection to learn that the 30 or more hours spent studying the news last month neither had any predictive ability during your activities of that month, nor did it impact your current knowledge of the world. So those were just two of them. And I mean, he would just say, I would guess every chapter of the book had he just ripped journalism.
Well, and what's crazy is he's writing that in 2001. Right? This is published In 2000, it was published in 2001.
Second edition was 2004.
Right. But you realize that, like, this is before we really got the full on internet level news hose.
Yeah.
Fire hose of news that we have today, where, like, as we've talked about, going all the way back to the first episode when we talked about Kevin Kelly and him talking about the stream and living in the stream.
Yeah.
And my kind of antipathy for that, or my sort of horror at that description of how you're going to live in this perpetual now of the stream. And I'm going, this is before even thinking about that he's saying, come on. I mean, Fox News was only 5 years old when he wrote this book.
Yeah.
Right. So you're looking at the 24-hour news cycle had just barely begun. I mean, we weren't even there, and he's already saying this, and he was right.
Yeah.
There are some things that the fact that he wrote this in this book has aged extremely well. I mean, we've talked about this on some other books on, like, well, did the predictions hold up or whatever? Some of the stuff that he's talking about in this, like, it's more, that's in one example, but it's more true in 2018 than it was in 2001 or 2004. That's for sure.
Well, in Kahneman's Thinking Fast and Slow is 2006, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. But now he's basing, Thinking Fast and Slow is based on, it's compiling all this research from Kahneman and Tversky from before that. So, Talib is interacting with their prior stuff.
Do you think Kahneman read this book?
Oh yeah. Yeah. I mean, he references Talib in the preface of that book. So there's some back and forth.
Remember the thing you brought up about Kahneman finding his friend in New Zealand and then finding his friend again in
yes, yeah.
London?
That Kahneman didn't actually account for statistics as well as I would have expected there, and actually Talib would have something to say about that. And
he did. He had a section about that in the book, and I was like, and it was exactly what you said. And I was like, did Kahneman not read this? Because Talib was talking about that error, and it's the error that you pointed out that Kahneman made in the book. Yeah, well, this was written before that one.
The thing is, though, Talib it repeatedly says that even trained statisticians, even people who have really good training in mathematics and probability and all sorts of things, we tend to make those errors.
Yeah.
And we tend to be unconscious of it when we do, even though we should know better, even when we do know better.
Yeah.
And that's something that Kahneman talks about as well. So, I mean, they're both. One of the things that's actually key to remember about both Talib and Kahneman is that where they are wrong, they're at least humble.
Yeah.
Right. They're at least acknowledging that, yeah, I'm probably, as guilty as anybody on some of this stuff. And I'm probably falling prey to it even in these pages on occasion. They'd be the first to tell you. And you got to give them credit for that.
Yeah.
So my next thing, less a humorous thing, but again, getting at what Talib is doing in this book. And one of the things that he does throughout this book is he wants to make a distinction between models and numbers and probability as it's usually perceived and its actual function in the world. And one of the mantras of this book is this idea that mathematics is really a tool for meditation, not something that actually maps onto the world perfectly. And in this, he actually is following the Greek philosophers like Pythagoras or Plato and others who they actually did use mathematics as a meditative tool, and they used it for philosophical. Mathematics was a tool of philosophy, and that's really what Talib is wanting to do. And then he wants to apply that to how you actually interact with the world. This quote actually, I think, gets to that to a large degree. He says, probability is not a mere computation of odds on the dice or more complicated variants. It is the acceptance of the lack of certainty in our knowledge and the development of methods for dealing with our ignorance. And that's what he wants to get at repeatedly, and he develops this thought further and says, listen, in textbooks and casinos, you get distinct odds. You're told that, you get a mathematical problem. Like there are this many cards, this many possible outcomes, or this, you spin the roulette wheel and this is how many. Yeah, you get that in those environments. But when you're actually out in the world, you don't know how many variants there could be. I mean, the number is infinite. So how can you calculate probabilities when you have potentially infinite possibilities? Well, you can't. What you can do is you can talk about probability in terms of a lack of certainty and then what may or may not be more likely based on certain factors, but we can't calculate it the same way. You have to learn that. You have to learn the uncertainty and then learn how to plan for it as best you can. And he really wants to hit how that has to work. And I think he does a terrific job, again, repeatedly explaining that idea. All right, you're up.
My next one, it is optimal for someone, when in doubt, to systematically reject the new idea, information, or method. Clearly and shockingly, always.
Yeah. And again, this is where he's very similar to G.K. Chesterton, who has one of my favorite quotes on this. Tradition is the democracy of the dead. G.K. Chesterton would say that tradition is the most democratic thing there is, because tradition is the democracy of the dead. All the dead who established those traditions over generations, figuring out that, well, things work better this way than this way, they've made their vote. And so if we're going to overrule them, we'd better have a good reason for it, why we as modern dictators are deciding to overrule the votes of our predecessors. Talib is totally on board with that. C.S. Lewis wrote something similar to that too. It's an article I assign at the beginning of every one of my classes. That he actually wrote as a preface to a volume on it was a new translation of Athanasius on the Incarnation, but it was published separately as On the Reading of Old Books. And Lewis says you should read 2 old books for every one new one you read, just as a way to insulate yourself against the new ideas, because old ideas at least have been tested. New ideas, well, you never know what's good or not yet. You can't know until those have been in history long enough to have been tested. And Talib is totally on board with that. Yep.
All right, what's your next one?
All right, let's see. You take one more while I look for my next one here. I'm choosing between a number of them.
Well, I just got a kick out of every time that he referenced the Nobel Prize. He called it the Swedish Central Bank Prize in honor of Alfred Nobel.
Well, he actually, he's right about that though, because the Nobel Prize in Economics cannot actually call itself the Nobel Prize in Economics the same way as the rest. It's actually the Nobel Memorial Prize in Economic Sciences, or the Swedish National Bank's Prize in Economic Sciences in memory of Alfred Nobel is actually its full name.
Okay.
The reason
he's just calling it
well, he is partly, he's doing that because that's its name, and because he wants to remind everybody that it's actually not one of the original Nobels, and that it shouldn't be looked at with the same reverence as the rest, as he says later that they're going to, that the committee who has awarded those various awards to certain people that he calls out in this book, that they'll be regarded with the same kind of laughter eventually as the people who opposed Galileo or otherwise, that they've been ignorant repeatedly. So yeah.
Well, he also talked about having to bow before the King of Sweden, and so I just kind of, like, throughout the book I took those as another cut at the prize or at the whole situation.
Oh, he's taken a dig, no doubt.
Yeah.
So okay, so let's see. I
have another one here if you want.
Yeah, go for it. Go for another one.
All right, so he makes this comment. He goes, "The publisher will never put on the jacket of a book anything but the best praise. And I laughed at that because Skin in the Game has the first quote that Talib has on the back of Skin in the Game is this one. The problem with Talib is that he's an a-hole. Okay, sorry. The problem with Taleb is not that he's an a-hole. He is an a-hole. The problem with him is that he's right. And this quote is from Dan from Prague, Czech Republic, on Twitter. So he goes against that quote in this book, that the publisher will never put in the jacket of the book anything but the best praise. And the very first one on Skin in the Game is how he's an a-hole. I just thought that was, when I saw that at the bookstore, I was laughing so hard.
Yeah, when you get to the point as a writer that you can begin to choose your jacket blurbs and put that one on there, you know you've made it.
Dan from Prague.
You know you've made it. Okay, so my next one would say, here we go. He says, perhaps ridding ourselves of our humanity is not in the works. We need wily tricks, not some grandiose moralizing help. I despise the moralizers beyond anything in this planet. I still wonder why they blindly believe in ineffectual methods. Delivering advice assumes that our cognitive apparatus, rather than our emotional machinery, exerts some meaningful control over our actions. We will see how modern behavioral science shows this to be completely untrue. So, I mean, and this is where he gets to this idea that, listen, and he has an entire chapter on this in terms of putting wax in your ears, that you need to learn as human beings, we need to learn that, well, I got weaknesses. And, telling me, elsewhere he says, there's a category of people who think that the cure for obesity is to inform people that they should be healthy. And he's like, well, no, really, Sherlock. You think? But, maybe just telling us that we should be healthy isn't going to do anything. You actually need to take specific steps, and you need to find ways to take specific steps to trick yourself into actually doing the stuff that is healthy. Mm-hmm. And that you need training in the tricks, and you need motivation for the tricks, and you got to find ways to push those buttons. And that's not so easy. That's not just about moralizing it. You got to actually you got to play around to get that. You got to, if your weakness is junk food, then get the junk food out of your house and find ways to disincentivize it and play games with yourself to where you're no longer a slave to it. And
perfect example of that is the Zombie Run app. Have you heard of that?
Yeah.
So you if you hate running but you need to run to get healthy or something, get the Zombie Run app, and while you're running, it creates a story that zombies are chasing you and you've got to get around, but it's using GPS, so it knows what's coming up, and you got to get around this hill because zombies are chasing you. So it turns it into a story. But yeah,
I got one more here. This one's just a nice aside from him. He says, I can be extremely humiliating when someone rubs me the wrong way with inelegant pompousness. And this is where I'm right with you, dude. Kindred spirit here.
Well, along the lines of the wax in the ears that you just mentioned, this quote, recall that the accomplishment from which I derive the most pride is my weaning myself from television and the news media. And I thought it was so brilliant, his the way that he parts from news and doesn't watch news. He doesn't completely just like not have a TV or anything like that. He has the TV on all day long, and he has it on news, but he turns the volume off. Yeah,
that's in his trading desk. Yeah, at his trading desk. Yeah.
So yeah, he basically watches them all gesticulate and do all that, but there's no power behind it because there's no words. He can't hear a thing they're saying, and that's how he puts the wax in his ears for news media. And I just thought that was so funny.
Yeah. You got another one?
Me?
Yep.
Okay. This one was it was like a throwaway line. It was just kind of tossed in there, but we could sit and discuss this for hours. Recall that the epic heroes were judged by their actions, not by the results. And it's just yeah. But I mean, what are we judged by today? We're mostly judged by our actions. The epic heroes, by the results. Sorry, but the epic heroes were judged by their actions, and just something to ponder. It was just kind of a
this is where I got to give my dad a lot of credit over the years. My dad has remarkably over the years been very resistant to hindsight bias, and trained me in particular. I don't know how much Stephanie got from him on this, but he trained me in particular to always consider, to always judge decisions on the basis of the information that was known when the decision was made, not on the basis of the outcome of the decision. And that was something very, very early. And actually, what's funny is I learned that as much from him in watching football as anything else. Because we'd go to a game together. We back when we lived in Bloomington, we'd go to watch some relatively bad Big Ten football. And we'd sit in the stands and something would happen and everybody around us would be moaning and complaining about a bad play call, this or that or whatever. My dad would turn to me and be like, that wasn't a bad play call. They're just judging it on the basis of the outcome. But here's what they were doing. Like, this is the reason for it. And, just because it didn't work doesn't mean it wasn't the right call. Yeah. And I got that out of sports as much as anything. And, playing sports with him coaching me at different points, learning that, sometimes you make the right decision and it just doesn't work. Yeah. Could you have done something else? Yeah, but who knows what the possible outcome of that might have been? That might have gone even worse. Yeah. You can't judge by outcome. All you can do is judge by whether you made the best possible decision, whether you made a defensible decision, given the information that you have access to at the time. And, that's Talib's big thing repeatedly here.
And didn't he talk about it in terms of regret too? Like you can't. Yep. You can't look back and regret something if at that time that was the information that you had. Yeah.
How can I regret a decision that I would, if I were given the exact same information today that I had then? How can I regret that decision if I would make the same decision given the same information? Yeah. I can't justifiably regret that. All I can do is say, well, chance and, hindsight show that it didn't work, but I don't know that anything else would have. Maybe doing this would have, but how would I have known to make that decision? Can't regret it. Can't look back on that and say, man, I wish I'd have done something else. Well, did what I had, what I thought was best at the time. Yeah. And, that reading some of this actually makes me respect my dad that much more in terms of that emphasis in his life, which is hard to live that way. Because we have a tendency to kind of want to look back and do some revisionist history and counterfactuals and all that. And Talib's point on all this is doing that opens the door to a lot of stuff where, again, you're discounting the role of change or the role of chance. Mm-hmm. So here's another one for me, another one of my favorites. Lucky fools do not bear the slightest suspicion that they may be lucky fools. By definition, they do not know that they belong to such a category. They will act as if they deserve the money.
What's the quote he starts every meeting off with? Like, we're all a bunch of idiots. Yep. Fortunate to know that we are idiots.
Yep. Just a reminder, we're all a bunch of idiots.
That's a good one. All right,
one other one. It's in the same section as that one. It's the same principle here. He says, one cannot consider. Here we are. One cannot consider a profession without taking into account the average of the people who enter it, not the sample of those who have succeeded in it. And so much of this book deals with the survival, with the survivor bias The idea of only judging on the basis of the people left at the end, the people left standing, rather than all the people who've, been tagged by the dodgeball and are out. He says, no. You have to consider everybody who's left, or everybody who entered, not only those who are left. And he says, in the same concept here, $10 million earned through Russian roulette does not have the same value as $10 million earned through the diligent and artful practice of dentistry. Mm-hmm. Why? Because the $10 million earned through the artful practice of dentistry is much less based on chance. There's basically almost 0% chance that is going to lead to you putting a bullet in your brain, right? As opposed to, say, a 1 in 6 chance that you die and you don't get the 10 million. The downside risk is much higher. So he's big on weighting both sides of an equation. It's not just that you got 10 million. You may have gotten 10 million by being an idiot. So your 10 million is not of the same value as the person who got the 10 million by diligent practice. It's a really, really hard insight to wrap your head around, but he's right.
Mm-hmm. All right, my last one. A mild degree of unpredictability in your behavior can help to protect yourself in situations of conflict.
Yeah, that's outstanding. Okay, I've got one or two more. Let's see. Okay. What sounds intelligent in a conversation or a meeting, or particularly in the media, is suspicious. Any reading of the history of science would show that almost all the smart things that have been proven by science appeared like lunacies at the time they were first discovered. Oh, that's just so outstanding. I mean, but it's absolutely right.
Yeah.
The stuff that we all laugh about, oh, those idiots in the past. Well, they were idiots just like us. And this is one of the things that article that I mentioned by C.S. Lewis talks about that every age has the things that the next era looks back and says about them. I can't believe they believed that. I mean, even our own age has that. The problem is we don't have the benefit of the next generation to look back and be able to test ourselves with that. And so Lewis says the only way you can test yourself on modern trends and modern fashions is to go back and read the old books because you don't have access to the future's books. So at least take a look at critiques from antiquity, which again, that's what Talib does. Talib has a way of doing the same thing there. And it's just very smart. A couple more. This one's a longer one, but again, this gets to his critique of Warren Buffett, among others. But he says, I will set aside the point that I see no special heroism in accumulating money, particularly if, in addition, the person is foolish enough to not even try to derive any tangible benefit from the wealth, aside from the pleasure of regularly counting the beans. I have no large desire to sacrifice much of my personal habits, intellectual pleasures, and personal standards in order to become a billionaire like Warren Buffett. And I certainly do not see the point of becoming one if I were to adopt Spartan, even miserly habits and live in my starter house. Something about the praise lavished upon him for living in austerity while being so rich escapes me. If austerity is the end, he should become a monk or a social worker. We should remember that becoming rich is a purely selfish act, not a social one. The virtue of capitalism is that society can take advantage of people's greed rather than their benevolence. But there is no need to, in addition, extol such greed as a moral or intellectual accomplishment. The reader can easily see that aside from very few exceptions like George Soros, I am not impressed by people with money. Becoming rich is not directly a moral achievement. But that is not where the severe flaw in the book lies. And he's critiquing there the millionaire next door. But basically he says, come on, like you're gonna lavish praise on someone for becoming a billionaire and then not actually doing anything to use that money? Like, wait, that doesn't make any sense.
When it glosses over the randomness aspect of it, which is the part he hates about that.
Well, he hates that, but he also hates the idea that earning money is in itself treated as a moral success.
Yeah.
And then that living austerely despite having money is actually a moral good. He's like, well, why? You made all this money. Now, what's the benefit? Like, how does it make you more moral not to use it? And that's actually a worthwhile point that I think often people don't understand. So, and he mentions there his respect for George Soros, and the place where he actually gets his respect of Soros is something, again, where this is a place where, again, my dad is very, very much like this, and I've tried to live the same way. And he says, although Soros did not deliver anything meaningful in his writings, he says Soros is a lousy philosopher, he knew how to handle randomness by keeping a critical, open mind and changing his opinions with minimal shame, which carries the side effect of making him treat people like napkins. He walked around calling himself fallible, but was so potent because he knew it, while others had loftier ideas about themselves. And that idea of, be willing to adapt to new ideas and to the randomness of the world. And if something changes, change your mind with it. Again, that's something that Talib really pushes hard, and is something that I really liked about this book.
Yeah.
All right. I think one more before I'm going to save one for the very end, but I think I'll do one more here before we get to any additional discussion of specific thematic stuff.
Well, while you're looking for it, I'll read. This is praise from the back of this book, Fooled by Randomness, and I thought it was hilarious. This is the book that rolled down Wall Street like a hand grenade. Because he does pick on Wall Street quite a bit, and stock pickers in particular.
Yeah, so here we go. Here's the last one that I was looking for. Why do I want... People might ask me, why do I want everybody to learn let me try this again. People might ask me, why do I want everybody to learn some statistics? The answer is that too many people read explanations. We cannot instinctively understand the nonlinear aspect of probability. And that's in specifics. He talks about how interpretation is nonlinear in that a 2% move is not twice as significant an event as a 1%. It's rather 4 to 10 times as significant. And he says a 7% move can be several billion times more relevant than a 1% move. The headline of the Dow moving by 1.3 points on my screen today has less than 1 billionth of the significance of the serious 7% drop of October 97. And that idea, it's hard to wrap your head around, but getting some rudimentary understanding of statistics so that you can think around those problems and really spending time addressing that kind of the difference between signal and noise and all that's really useful. And again, I think this book does a great job of addressing that.
Yeah.
So, all right. So let's get to we've gone through a lot of concepts and so on through various quotes. What are some additional things that you had in mind that you wanted to touch on before we wrap up?
Well, I wanted to discuss Kahneman and heuristics just briefly. A question I asked you in the Kahneman episode of Thinking Fast and Slow was, what was the impact of this book in economics? And on page 187, Talib says that Kahneman is the one who has exerted the most influence on economic thinking over the past 2 centuries. So that was quite the comment. This Talib also helped me understand heuristics better, I think, than Kahneman did. And even one of our books from last year had a better definition than I think Kahneman gave in the book. But one of the ways that Talib talked about it in this book was that our heuristics are basically our rules or code for living. And it's more of the unconscious code or rules that we live by. But that helped me understand it more, that it's more of our rules or code of living. And with that in mind, I wanted to ask you a question, Jason, on, because Kahneman's book, that was really the first time I'd ever heard or read about heuristics, and then now it's come up in this book as well. How do emotions and heuristics differ?
So that's the full on.
That's the full question. But okay. Like with heuristics, it's our code of living, but it's kind of that unconscious immediate response to things, but so are emotions. So how do those two things differ?
So heuristics are mental shortcuts. That's the main difference. So okay. What you're talking about is mechanisms that explain. Heuristics are ways of explaining how we make certain decisions using shortcuts mentally, so that we don't have to actually think about using second order thinking. That system 2 that Kahneman talks about. And for those of you who didn't listen to that episode, it's a couple episodes ago. It's worth the listen. Also worth the read of that book. But basically, it's just explaining how we get from point A to point B and that kind of thinking. That we have certain shortcuts, certain biases, certain heuristic tools to think without having to logically go through and slow down each time we come across a given situation, right? Mm-hmm. So that's what a heuristic is. Now, emotions are more states of mind that are loosely categorized into specific descriptors like anger, anger, grief, all sorts of happiness or whatever. You can. That's in an emotional state that can be triggered by heuristics. They can influence heuristics, but it's a different category in terms of how that all works. Now, the thing is, it all relates together. So your emotions are impacted by what happens around you and by, circumstances and so on. So if you have a pet die, you're probably going to have a specific sad emotional reaction to that, because something has the stimulus, the external stimulus is going to trigger specific chemical reactions that are going to affect your mood and so on. But that's not the same thing as a specific heuristic there, right? That's independent of that. At the same time, on the flip side, your specific emotional state may impact which shortcuts get taken. So if you're feeling more happier and more energetic, you may take a specific, you may be more prone to certain biases. And actually in the behavioral research, there's some indications that your mood or your emotional state actually impacts what kinds of decisions or what kinds of biases you're more prone to in certain states. Mm-hmm. So they're related, but they're not the same thing. You're talking about, again, all of these things are abstractions, right? Mm-hmm. When we're talking about system 1, system 2, we're not talking about like two separate. This is if you've seen, have you seen the Pixar movie Inside Out?
No.
Okay, for the audience out there who has, in Inside Out, what you have is you've got like different little people inside the head of each person that represent different emotions and different things. So you have anger, and you have happiness, and you have depression, and all of these different things that when that person is, and they're all working together in the brain, and they have a central command center and all this. And actually kids only can have one in charge at once, which I think is actually so true, right? A child is either in like the depths of rage or flips the switch and is really happy, like 5 minutes apart. There's not room for mixed emotional states, right?
Yeah.
But it's not like that. with human beings, that we have like homunculus number 1, which is system 1, and then homunculus number 2, which has the glasses on and thinks more slowly, and it gets passed along. These are abstractions. They're ways of narrativizing the ways that we actually make our decisions, and the biases and all these, the heuristics are talking about ways that we tend to default, but it's not exactly, but it's still a story to explain how we work rather than how we work itself. And that's a distinction that's important to make.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, cool. I had a few other things for nitty gritty, but do you have any?
I mean, I could go for hours on this book. I think one thing that I really enjoyed in this is his critique of economic modeling, of macroeconomic modeling, and econometricians in general. This idea that he says, what has gone wrong with the development of economics as a science? And he says, answer: there was a bunch of intelligent people who felt compelled to use mathematics just to tell themselves that they were rigorous in their thinking, that theirs was a science. And he basically says all of this modeling that's been applied is either misguided in treating historical situations as though they're controlled trials that actually tell us how the world works. But the problem is all of these are one-offs, right? Just because it happened that way in the Depression doesn't mean it's gonna repeat itself the next time around, because all these things have changed. Mm-hmm. So you can't model that. You can use the certain things as tools to give you something to meditate on and to think about, and maybe to understand a little bit about the mechanisms, but we can't really model things the way that econometricians have seemed to think. And again, he calls that into question and really thoroughly mocks that field to a large degree. And I think does a good job with that. And this is where actually, if you're a listener to the EconTalk podcast hosted by Russ Roberts, which I think is one of the best podcasts out there, Russ has been very influenced by Talib over the years and has become increasingly skeptical. If you've listened since 2006, he's much more skeptical of the decided weight of the evidence in various economic dogma than he was in 2006. He's much more skeptical about what we actually know than he was in 2006. And a lot of that goes back to him being very familiar with this kind of critique.
Well, and he just had Talib on his podcast
twice in the last 6 months.
Yeah. So we'll link those as well. There was one part that was really interesting to me, where they would deliver food to birds at random times and the birds would start doing dances. I guess thinking that, if they would do a certain dance, that would cause the food to come, because it wouldn't come at the same time every
these
time.
are the old B.F. Skinner box experiments, where what was happening is the bird would be doing a specific thing when the food would come. And then before too long, the bird would actually begin to identify the thing that it was doing. It would be like a superstition. Like, wow, my team scored 4 runs when I wore this hat, so I need to make sure that I wear this hat in the 5th inning the next time, because then the birds did exactly the same kind of thing. Which, I mean, it's remarkable. I mean, my cat, Oscar, is like this. And I got to give him credit. He's a smart little joker, because, he knows I don't like him begging. But he still, when he smells or hears the tuna can opening, there's nothing that cat likes in the world more than tuna. And he believes that if I'm having tuna, he should have some. So there's one time, this is a few years ago, he hears me opening a can of tuna and comes over and starts to beg a little bit, and I was not having it. So I picked him up and I stuck him in the bathroom just adjacent to the kitchen and shut the door and shut him in there until I was done preparing my tuna and all this. And then I took the tuna juice that I'd squeezed out of the can and a little bit of tuna. I put it on a plate and I put it down by his food, which is just outside the kitchen over near that bathroom. And so then after a few minutes, and I was satisfied that he wasn't going to identify those activities together, identify the begging as what was giving him the reward. I open the door and he trots out and discovers the tuna there. The next day, and this is an N of 1, I'm preparing food in the kitchen and I turn and I see the cat sitting in the doorway of that bathroom. Like he's in the bathroom looking through the doorway looking at me like, okay, is this what works? There's your example. And what would happen is the birds actually would do the same thing. They learned pretty quickly and they decided that their rain dance or their food dance is actually what brought them the food. Yeah.
And again, just ways that we easily get fooled by randomness.
Yep. And we do the same stuff. And Talib actually admits, like, yeah, I found myself to be as prone to these superstitions as anyone else, despite the fact that I'm the guy who writes about randomness. I'm as likely to do these things as anyone else. Yeah. I just hate myself for it.
One other thing I have trouble with is the infinite number of monkeys eventually writing the Iliad. I know with infinite, yes, it's possible, but it just still, he talks about, if you had an infinite number of monkeys in a room, eventually one of them would type out the Iliad. It kind of goes back to the chaos and order. No, it kind of goes to the chaos and order thing. And it's like, if you shook enough rooms with 747 parts, would it, an infinite number of shakings, put a 747 together?
Well, no. And in that case, actually, nobody would make that argument because it's not a matter of just it's not a matter of the pieces falling together. Those actually have to get, stuff has to get riveted and screwed in and so on. So it's a more complex process. The argument with the typewriters is that if you gave them, basically, and ultimately you give enough information, random sequences are going to produce non-random outcomes.
Yeah.
Given a long enough time frame.
Yeah.
So the key there is your insight or your instinct there, your intuition is right, that it would never happen that if you took monkeys and put them on typewriters, that any of them would actually produce anything coherent. But the key there is infinite, right? You have an infinite number of monkeys in an infinite amount of time. Given infinity, nothing is impossible because you're dealing with infinity. So it's really a meaningless example in that sense because it doesn't apply to the world as it works. But the purpose of it is as a thought experiment to talk about how random sequences can produce and do produce patterns that look non-random.
Yeah.
And that we then assign wrongly non-random causes to those attributes or to those outcomes. And the key there is to understand that not everything that appears non-random is actually the result of something that is anything other than chance. Sometimes chance produces something that looks non-random. So we have to be careful with how we assign causality. That's really the whole point of that. And that's so much of this book is about that, learning to be very careful about how you apply causality. And this is a very, very old warning. Very old. I mean, you go back, so much of this is actually a discussion. I mean, you can look in the Bible, and the book of Job is challenging something like Proverbs, where you've got these ideas that if you behave wisely and you don't act like a fool, then your life is going to go better and you'll be rewarded. Well, Job does all these things and does it all perfectly, and then suffers mightily precisely because he does those things. And then his buddies come along and they say, well, dude, what'd you do? Because what they do is they look at the consequence, they look at the outcome, and they judge causality on the basis of the outcome. And normally they'd probably be right. But the problem in what the book of Job is actually challenging is this idea that you can actually judge the process by the outcome.
Yeah.
That's something that's fundamental to the book of Job in the Hebrew Bible, is this idea that, listen, just because you got a crappy outcome doesn't mean you didn't do it right. In fact, sometimes the right action can produce precisely that. And the book of Kohelet, or in the Christian canon, is called Ecclesiastes. it has a lot of the same discussions. And in fact, you've got time and the verse that says time and chance happen to all of them. This idea of chance, that how it impacts the wise and the fool alike. And who knows, you may get good or bad as a result of what you do. And it actually may not, you may do the right thing and just get unlucky. Sorry. And you know, it's got a number of meditations on that saying, you shouldn't be looking just at the outcomes here.
Yeah.
So this is a very, very old warning. And it's one that we need every generation. And Talib happens to be the guy that's stepping forward and doing that in this case. And he does it with some nice mathematical, quasi-scientific tools to aid him in that meditation. I think it's very, very useful.
What other books by him have you read? You've read Skin in the Game?
I've not read Skin in the Game, though I've read chapters of Skin in the Game, because the thing is, what he's done at different points is he's published like pieces of works or essays that are chapters of different works that he's done. So I've read a number of things that he's written that are in like chapters of different books.
Yeah.
But I haven't actually read all those books. And that was one of the things I wanted to do this year, is I determined to read the actual books that he'd written. So this one, Black Swan, and Skin in the Game were three that I wanted to get in. And then of course he's just now put out another, the name of which is Skin in the Game is the most recent, but Anti-Fragile is the one also, is another that I want to read all four. If I can, I want to read all four this year. Yeah. Because I think that, again, I've heard him talk about this stuff. I've followed what he's written. I've read a number of things that are in those, and I've listened to his summaries of all this, but I actually want to read the books themselves. Yeah. And that's something that doing this podcast affords me the opportunity to do. So.
Well, and you recommended the Black Swan to me, so that's on my list this year. And then, after reading this one, I want to add the two others to next year's list. So you want to close this out with in the nitty gritty with another thought?
Yeah, I think again, there's so much richness to this book that I don't think I could do any more do it any more justice, or do anything any justice from here by trying to spend 5 minutes talking about one specific idea. Just you need to read this book without question. And that I'm gonna leave off my and I'll treat this as my conclusion. I want to leave off in my conclusion his final word here. He says it took him an entire lifetime to find out, and that's a lifetime up to 2004 when he did his second edition, but to figure out what his generator, what he's referring to in terms of the generative core, the axiomatic framework of his sort of philosophical contribution here. So if you want to know what this book actually is about, the core idea that underlies so much of what Talib does here and also in the book, he summarizes it this way. We humans, we favor the visible, the embedded, the personal, the narrated, and the tangible. We scorn the abstract. Everything good, aesthetics, ethics, and wrong, fooled by randomness, with us seems to flow from that principle. That's where he goes. Wow. And I think that's a great summary of what he does in this book. There's a lot of warnings in here. There's a lot of important ideas that are just that if you want to think about how life works, there's a lot of really generative, fruitful material here to work from. Book that I can't recommend much more highly. I think this is one of those books that you talk about summer reading. We talked about this with a couple of our books. I put this along with like Once an Eagle and a couple others, probably Thinking Fast and Slow, handful of books that I would say need to be summer reading for every high school student. This is one of those. College students, every college student should have read this book. And we'd be better off as a society if everybody did.
So if you could only read one book, would it be this or Thinking Fast and Slow?
Probably this one.
Really?
Yeah. I don't know. What's your view on that?
I would say Thinking Fast and Slow, but I'm wondering if I had read this one first, if it would be different. But I think Thinking Fast and Slow was such a mind opener for me. And I know you'd seen a lot of those ideas already in articles and that sort of thing, but that was really the first I had come across that. And I think just seeing it, I really.
I mean, I had some social scientific training. I mean, that's some of the stuff I've taught in the past. So that was new.
Yeah. But I like the style of this one a lot better.
Yeah. And that's part of the reason that I would recommend this one over that one, is that this one is one that the people who start this one are much more likely to finish this one, I think, than they are to finish Thinking Fast and Slow. So now the thing is, your best bet is to read both of them, because Thinking Fast and Slow gives you much more information about specific heuristics and biases that are inherent to the way that we human beings tend to think. But this one has a lot of very useful ruminations on and is more memorable in some ways just because of the writing. And it's more, and so people are more likely to finish it who start it, because it's just that much more enjoyable to read.
Well, what's funny too is the Michael Lewis book I have on my list this year, The Undoing Project. I've had the book now for a while. I didn't realize until this past week that is about Kahneman. And what's his partner's name?
Amos Tversky.
Tversky. That book is about them. I had no idea. So
yeah, this is 2018 for you, Eric, is the year of Kahneman and Tversky.
So yeah, I've started. I may start doing this in my reviews from now on, but asking myself two questions about the book. One, did it keep me up? And by that, was it hard for me to put the book down to go to sleep? And I value sleep. I like going to sleep. So if a book if I can't put it down, that's a really good indicator of how much I'm enjoying it. And so, did this book keep me up? Yes. And then the second one, is it a tour de force? And I say that kind of in a funny way, because I always hate seeing like the reviews on the back of a book, like, was this, this is a tour de force. It's like the go-to review for people. But is this a tour de force? I mean, is this like one of the top books? And I would say yes. For me, I liked Thinking Fast and Slow perhaps a little better. But as I said, the style of this one a lot better. Fooled by Randomness. So it has me really interested in the author, and as I mentioned before, I'm looking forward to reading his other works this year and next.
Yeah, as am I. And I don't think I'll ever cease finding Talib useful and interesting and hilarious, and so there's I don't think I'll tire of ever having something of his on my list. So I think it's a good time, as good a time as any to go ahead and wrap this show. So once again, if you've been enjoying our show, please tell a friend, give us feedback on social media. You can follow us via social media on Instagram, on Twitter, @Books of Titans. Also, do us a favor, give us a review on Apple Music or wherever you listen to your podcasts. 5-star reviews go a long way towards getting more listeners and helping us out a lot on this podcast. So yeah, for Erik Rostad, I'm Jason Staples. This has been the Books of Titans podcast. Keep listening, keep reading, keep thinking, and keep improving.
Don't get fooled. I pity the fool.
I pity the fool. I made this.